Hello, I'm Jim Schaefer, the producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Susan J. Douglas, who's here to discuss her book, Listening In, Radio and the American Imagination from Amos and Andy and Edward R. Murrow to Wolfman Jack and Howard Stern. That's quite a range there.
It's a mouthful.
Yeah.
But my publishers wanted readers to understand the range, and they figured that the only way they could do that is by sticking all of those four names in there.
Well, going from Amos and Andy to Howard Stern is just, well, it really does.
There's some irony there, yeah.
It really goes. One of the fascinating things about your book is that, and we were talking about this just before we started videotaping, is that people thought radio was going to go out of fashion when television came in, and it really kind of is coming back into its own now. And I think there's been a number of people talking about how they liked your book and were reading it just partly for that reason.
Well, you know, you're right. When television began to proliferate between the late 40s and early 50s, people thought that radio was just going to die. And there were lots of predictions by network executives that it was all over for radio. And of course, one of the things that did happen is radio became de-networked, right? The network programming went to television, and radio did lose its primetime audience in the evening. But radio, at the same time, became more profitable than ever before because radio went local. Radio discovered young people, and radio discovered drive time. And since then, radio has continued to be incredibly profitable, but also has continued to be an important cultural force.
Well, one of the interesting things about your book is you talk about this is one of the first times that someone's done this in quite a long time, trying to get a comprehensive handle or overview of what's been going on in the industry.
Well, you know, it's not just people in the business who predicted that radio would fall off the planet, you know, in the 1950s. Historians have treated it the same way. You know, there's so much historical work done on film, on television, but radio, including, the histories of radio, look at the golden years, but come 1950, nothing. So what I really wanted to do was connect the early years of radio to the later years of radio and show the continuity as well as the differences between those two periods.
Well, and there's some interesting issues in doing the research, like you're talking about how ephemeral the materials are, particularly for the early years where they didn't have much, or maybe just weren't aware of how to archive tapes and keep things like that.
Oh, doing radio history is really tough. You know, a lot of the stuff that was broadcast in the early years went off into the ether, and that was it. Never recorded, I mean, there was no magnetic tape until the late 1940s. There was wire tape in the 1940s, and I believe as early as the late 1930s. But most of the way you had to tape this stuff was on acetate discs. And, a lot of the networks didn't have the foresight to think, oh, this is going to be an interesting historical document for somebody, 50 years from now. But fortunately, some of it was saved. And so the radio historian can go to a few of these museums and archives around the country and actually get to hear stuff from the early to mid-1930s. And I think it's a miracle that any of it was saved.
What other materials do you use? Programming schedules? Or?
People use a range of materials in addition to listening to the shows themselves. There are transcripts of shows in various archives. There are written scripts of shows that may not have been recorded. There are people's correspondences and memoranda and memoirs. So there are written documents around the country that people can use. I also wanted to look at the way in which radio was covered in the press from the 1920s to the present, and I looked at both the popular press to see what they were saying about radio controversies, radio programming, and also at the trade press, because there you can get a lot of good business history about what people in the industry itself are worried about, concerned about, what trends they're tracking. So I found those to be valuable sources as well.
Actually, that business aspect was one of the most fascinating things of the book about when radio began. People weren't terribly aware of the commercial aspects of it. In fact, all you needed was some batteries and a crystal and all that stuff, and then people would be doing it. But as the industry started up, maybe you'd like to touch on that some.
Well, we take advertising so for granted today as the method of support for broadcasting. And of course, we're bombarded by ads everywhere we turn. that it's hard to realize and appreciate that advertising as the source of financial support for broadcasting was very controversial. People were opposed to it, from the Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover, who was the, oversaw radio before the invention of the Federal Radio Commission and the FCC. A lot of the public was opposed to advertising because they didn't want some salesman coming into their home and, giving out these sales pitches in the, in a man's castle. So we forget that this was a big contest over how radio was going to be supported, and there was an enormous amount of opposition to advertising becoming the main source of support. But over time, the forces of corporate America won out, and advertising was, it turned out, an effective way for the networks to both deliver audiences to advertisers and for advertisers to get their sales pitches out while also producing the programs themselves.
But there was also the ownership of the stations themselves, and then how that sort of kept amalgamating. It became bigger and bigger, and that was one of the concerns you expressed about how this corporate ownership has changed the radio in contemporary life anyway.
Yeah, well, this is a long story. I mean, when radio first started in the 20s, these were individually owned stations, and again, people forget that many of these stations were owned by labor unions or churches or schools and universities, civic groups, as well as newspapers and department stores and all the rest. And there was a lot of community radio on in the 1920s that catered to particular ethnic groups and even catered to Black Americans, as well as, more polished, more financially well-heeled stations. And it's really with the rise of the networks in the late 20s and early 30s that you start to see, with the rise of affiliation, more of these community stations going by the wayside. So by the 1930s, of course, we have network domination. Then in the 50s, with the de-networking of radio, you get back to more locally based radio stations, and you also get more experimentation. Then consolidation comes in again, and now, we're seeing a period of enormous consolidation, thanks in part to the Telecom Act of 1996, which eased a great deal of restrictions on the number of radio stations that any one entity could own. So you now have these huge radio consolidators like Capstar, Clear Channels, Jacor, owning not 10, not 20, hundreds, 400, 600, 800 radio stations. And what they've done with those radio stations is refined the art of niche marketing.
Homogenize and pasteurize.
Well, I mean, if you drive around the country, you could be in Albuquerque and you could be in Providence, Rhode Island, and if you turn on the oldie station, you're going to hear the same oldies, and you're going to hear the same oldies format. Or if you turn on smooth jazz, whether, again, you're in Albuquerque or Providence, you're going to hear David Benoit and, Spyro Gyra on exact same stuff. So the industry argues that, there's more diversity than ever because there are so many different stations that have so many different formats. But, diversity is really left at the door of these stations. You go to a smooth rock station that's, supposed to cater to somebody like me, who allegedly only wants to hear Billy Joel circa, 1980, right? And so once you get inside those formats, the range of diversity is very narrow. And look at the top 40 stations today that geared to kids. They play the same 6 songs every hour. And, so kids aren't hearing diversity on the radio. And on music radio in particular, neither are grown-ups.
Well, one of the new things that's coming in is outside of what we think of as is this internet radio, and they're starting up with the same diversity. But it'll be interesting to see if they have the same consequences of, the powers, the economic powers starting to shape the market and amalgamating and consolidating. But,
well, we'll see what happens, because one of the things that can happen on the internet, there are still, here and there, a few good radio stations that actually lovingly program their music so that there is surprise and unpredictability and diversity of musical styles. And once you've heard one of those stations, you want to keep listening to it. Well, the internet allows you to do that. Now, you can't bring it with you in your car, And, you know, you might be able to hear some of it at work, but not all the time. So mobility is still an issue. But I think what the internet is showing is that there is, despite all of this, the financial success of this niche marketing, an enormous desire among a lot of people to hear the kinds of radio stations that they used to hear, for example, in the early 1970s.
They had all the diversity well, one of the things that you talk about in your book is the audience, and this plays into this idea of imagined communities and the now time-honored thing with Benedict Anderson, but it really is a fascinating thing of the audience as an imagined community.
Well, you know, you can't use the term anymore, right, without, you know, saying Benedict Anderson
Right.
in the next sentence. And of course, you know, Anderson's book is very important and really laid out conceptually the role that he believes newspapers played in helping people imagine this thing called the nation. But think how much more powerfully radio did that. I mean, you know, people really were listening to the same thing simultaneously, you know, at the exact same time. And that really does bind people together. But, you know, the other thing I was really trying to do in this book is explore what it means to listen. Now, this may seem baldly obvious. You know, here's a mass medium that does not deny sight to its audience, so you'd have to think about what it means to listen. But when I was doing research for this book, I found that there was not one book about the history of radio that stopped for a minute and asked, what is so special about listening? And why are people so nostalgic about radio? And does it have something to do with the act of listening itself? And I believe it does. And so I think that it's not just that people would be listening to, you know, the World Series at the same time, or a fireside chat, or Wolfman Jack. It's that people knew, while not ever really articulating this, that millions of Americans were doing the same kind of cognitive work that they were doing at the same time. So they knew that other people around the country were imagining the trajectory of the ball in the ballpark. They were imagining the geometry of the ballpark. And I think it's that knowledge that people are imagining at the same time that you are, as well as the knowledge that they're listening to the same thing, that also bound people together.
It also functioned to it became part of the national discourse, so that if you didn't listen, you weren't aware of enough things to talk about when you're talking about conversation, and baseball scores and statistics and who made what play, and all that was part of what you got from radio or listening to Jack Benny.
Well, I think Jack Benny's a great example. I mean, you know, for anyone who has heard any old Jack Benny shows, we all know that he had his vault, right? That Jack Benny was a skinflint and hid all his money in his vault. Now, everybody imagined that vault. And, you know, the next day at work, you could talk about the Jack Benny show. And I think one of the delicious pleasures here is that you know that I've imagined the vault, I know you've imagined the vault, and we can talk about it as if we have some kind of collective vision of it. And yet, you know that your vision of the vault is specially yours, and my vision of the vault is specially mine. So we share something, and yet we hold something distinct and special that's our imagining. And I think that is a very special element of radio.
Well, you have that whole chapter, The Zen of Listening. I thought that was a lot of fun.
Well, you know, as I said, you know, people hadn't stood back and asked what it means to listen to something as opposed to seeing it. And so what I tried to do, and this was tough, I was trying to find cognitive psychologists, people working in neuroscience, who could talk to me about the process of listening, about the physiology of listening, about the phenomenology of listening. And this was tough because people doing that kind of work are doing very fine-grained, specific studies on how the brain recognizes perfect pitch, for example. So it was hard for me to find people who were doing this kind of work who felt comfortable enough standing back and thinking about it culturally. But I did find some people who were very helpful. Now, once you think about listening, then the next thing you have to confront is listening is not ahistorical, right? It's not that the people who listened to radio in the 1920s listened to it in the same way that people listen to radio today. So then you have to historicize the process of listening, and that's what I tried to do. I tried to develop this kind of archaeology of listening, and I think that people are not only nostalgic for what they listened to, they're nostalgic for how they listen to the radio. And I think that's an important feature of people's connection to the device as well.
Well, one of the fascinating things, in broad terms, is how a technology like radio for communication brought in an element that people didn't think about when they were plugging wires together and saying, oh, we can transmit a signal. But as it became more fully fleshed and developed, that it started having this aspect, and I think television has its unintended consequences, to use that phrase that's been in currency lately. But it is fascinating that it had this cachet that, people hadn't thought about, and now is one of the most profound reasons why people listen to it and have continued to listen to it in, National Public Radio and Garrison Keillor and all these favorite programs that people have on books and all of that kind of thing.
Well, if I say to you, Jim, did you hear the latest, Terry Gross, right? You and I automatically feel like we are part of a particular community, the NPR community.
Right.
Because if I say to somebody, have you heard the latest Fresh Air, and they have no idea what I'm talking about, there's just a break there. But people who know who Terry Gross is, right, and talk about Fresh Air, feel that they are part of something. So radio still has a very powerful community-building property to it.
One of the more recent things is this talk radio, and I'm not so sure I like all of that. It's fun in the sense that there's a conversation going on, but some of it gets a little strange. I mean, someone was telling me they were listening to a late night thing, and they were just talking about, sexual relationships and things. And it seems like that's almost been, for much of corporate, what I would call corporate radio, is that's kind of a fill the time kind of a thing. It's cheap to do, and you have call-ins. On the other hand, it's kind of liberating in the sense that people are able to express their opinion, but it's certainly been a phenomenon of late on radio.
Well, FM took over radio in the 1970s. At the beginning of the 70s, FM was still this kind of alternative, underground, format. AM was where the money was. By the end of the decade, nobody wanted to listen to music on AM. The stereos were in your car that played FM, and the rise of the component system allowed for very powerful FM listening. So AM was in trouble, and talk radio saved AM. Because people don't care about fidelity, high fidelity, right, when they're listening to talk.
I'm not sure they care about fidelity at all.
Well, they may not, but I still, if you're listening to music, you want, we've gotten
right.
spoiled. We want to hear stereo. We want to hear the richness of fidelity that we get with FM, but not with AM. And so talk in the 1980s really saved the AM band, and it has, of course, migrated to FM as well. I think the other thing about the 1980s that propelled talk radio is that many Americans began to feel that the network news, in particular, was getting more superficial, was top-down. It was all these elites from Washington, giving us their spin about this and that. And people were getting a bit fed up, and they could turn to talk and hear a different set of political sensibilities. They could also hear, for better or for worse, their fellow Americans hold forth about this or that. And one of the things that researchers discovered is that talk radio serves this important surveillance function, as it's called, in which I might tune into Rush Limbaugh, somebody with whom I disagree on about pretty much everything, right? But if I listen to Limbaugh, I'm listening to how people with whom I disagree think about issues, how they're talking about issues, so I can get a sense of how certain sectors of the population feel about certain things. And there are people who listen to talk radio specifically for that reason. The other reason that people listen to talk radio is, you're tired, it's the middle of the day. If you put music on, it's not going to get your blood boiling, when you're driving from A to B. But put on Dr. Laura, right, or put on Rush, or a whole host of other talk show hosts, and you get very engaged. And even if you're disagreeing, or maybe especially if you're disagreeing, it keeps you engaged and gets you through that drive.
Actually, underneath what you're saying, too, is how carefully the radio industry now gauges by surveys and documentation what they perceive to be the needs of, the Arbitron surveys and all that, of the needs of their audiences. So talk radio was in response to what people said they wanted out of radio at the time.
Yeah, talk radio was responding to what people wanted and to a kind of hole, if you will, in the public airwaves. But we also have to emphasize that the kind of talk radio we got was the result of the Reagan administration's FCC and its decision to stop enforcing the Fairness Doctrine in 1987. And the Fairness Doctrine had required that broadcasters allow people to hear controversial issues, and if controversial issues were going to be aired, that people had a right to hear at least two sides of that issue. Now, once you take that away, then you can have a talk radio station, for example, that airs almost exclusively right-wing conservative hosts and, not anybody else. So the kind of talk radio that we get, which is for the most part conservative, is also the result of governmental decisions under Reaganism to not require the kind of balance that we used to have.
Well, now, the governmental decisions have also encouraged the corporate consolidation of the market, too, because more stations could be owned by the same entity.
Right.
One of the things you talk about in your book was this notion of the ether, this place that existed that the radio waves disappeared into, but there's quite a romanticization that went on with that, this whole thing of the radio signal.
Well, look, the electromagnetic spectrum, as we refer to it today, is very difficult to wrap your brain around. You can't see it, you can't feel it, you can't smell it. It's sort of out there, it's out in the air, but it's not the air. And I think the ether was a very important romantic concept that actually did emerge out of scientific discourse in the late 19th and early 20th century that helped people kind of wrap their brains as best they could around how radio worked. And so they could envision some kind of, aerial sea, if you will, through which these radio waves, were transmitted and received. And ether, it's a wonderful concept. We don't use the term much anymore. You still hear it now and again, but I do think it helped people come to terms with a method of communications that, in fact, used no connecting wires.
And I bet you even today people don't quite understand how a signal sent from some other metropolitan place or some other place could come into your home, into a device, and you turn it on and there it is.
Right. I think most people don't understand that. And and also I think what mitigates against that also is now with cable and with computers, which are connected by various kinds of cables and wires, that makes it easier to understand how some signals get into our, there's a wire, okay, right, right. But I do think that understanding wave propagation and the electromagnetic spectrum and its frequency, you put this stuff in headlines and people, nod off.
What they will respond to is that, what was that James Thurber thing about the ant that thought electricity leaked out of certain, plugs? If you didn't have something plugged in, it would be coming out of the ceiling. One of the things that was fascinating is, as you ended the book, you ended it with a sigh and a kind of a lament that baby boomers will miss not only what they listen to, but how they listen to radio. And then in doing so, they want to dig out from under, and I thought this was fascinating, the avalanche of visual slag and want our imaginations back because we want and need to listen.
Well, I think when people talk about radio and radio nostalgia, people automatically think of the 1930s and 40s, right? They think Bob Hope, Jack Benny, Fibber McGee. But I'm nostalgic for radio, and I think a lot of us are, because, when I started working on this book and I was telling people, I'd say radio, and the next thing people would say to me is, radio. I mean, they would sigh, and they would invariably say the same thing. I remember lying in bed at night in the dark, sometimes under the covers, listening to the radio, right? And these were people born after World War II, so we all share this kind of primal experience of listening to the radio in particular ways. And, so I'm nostalgic, particularly for underground freeform progressive radio of the late 60s, early 70s, in which you had these really somnambulent sounding, disc jockeys who would play the most interesting sets of songs that involved very unusual juxtapositions of all kinds of stuff. And it wasn't just that you could actually play folk and rock and R&B in the same set. They also played classical music and jazz in the same set if they thought it worked. So that kind of listening, I think, teaches you or it cultivates in you a willingness to be playful as a listener, a willingness to indulge in audio experiments. Now we've got push-button listening. You know, you don't like it, hit the select button. And, you know, this gets back to the comment that you made earlier about how radio is researched now. The way songs are researched, you get a bunch of people, focus group, put them in a room, they listen to the first 10 seconds of a song, and then they hit the red button or the green button. Do they like it or not? Well, you know, that works well with certain kinds of catchy songs that maybe in 3 weeks you're going to, you know, be so sick of you wish you'd never heard. But the kind of music that takes time, that takes patience, that takes listening, gets, you know, wiped out of that. So I do think that many of us are nostalgic for radio stations that played a variety of music, old music and new music. Now, just because I'm, you know, an older person, does that mean I shouldn't be listening to the music that my college students are listening to? I mean, if anything, that's exactly what I should be listening to, so I understand what my students and what my daughter and her friends are thinking about and talking about, because music in this culture is such a rich repository of cultural politics, information about gender roles, about race, about all kinds of things that are of deep concern to young people, and not just young people. And yet I can't go to a radio station and hear music that I know and music that I might not know in an array that's intelligent and thoughtful and brought to me by a disc jockey who actually knows something about the music. I'm nostalgic for that. And I also think that this kind of push-button listening encourages sort of audio, you know, segregation that I think is unfortunate. You know, it goes in with this kind of gated-in communities that we have, this kind of gated-in listening. You know, we forget that radio was the most desegregated mass medium in the 1950s. African Americans were not on television, they were not in films, they were not in advertising, they were not in magazines, but they got on the radio. And I think that had a very important set of cultural and political consequences. And now, if I turn on the radio, the ad I'll get is, no rap, none of the time. Well, you know, maybe there's some rap music I should be listening to. Radio has become powerfully resegregated by gender, by race, and by age, and I think that's a pity and a loss.
But what's not a loss is your very nice book, and it's a lot of fun, and it gives an additional dimension to the whole thing, and we need that, I think, at this point.
Well, thanks.
Well, thank you for being on Rip Rap.
Well, thanks so much for having me.